Reversing the collapse/suicide of the West, everything seems to have been tried, and failed. Bruce Charlton. As a cheery reflection, as I read through histories and early accounts of the problem of the collapse of the West, it does begin to seem that everything designed to reverse it has, by now, somewhere or another, been tried and has failed. All the many would-be solutions have not just failed to fly, they couldn't even take off. The problem seems to lie too deep to be addressed. It lies, indeed, in changes in the nature of actual human beings, en masse, and it has to do with the nature of human groups, the relation of the individual with the collective. Humans used to be effortlessly, because intrinsically, semi-collective beings, like it or like it not, we participated in the life of the group, and conceptualized ourselves thus. Such participation was inevitably religious, except for a brief, one generation. Transitional semi-religion that could be called nationalism. That doesn't happen anymore. The 20th century replacement of group participation and religion was totalitarianism, which is top-down brainwashing, surveillance and group control by massive propaganda, censorship, with bureaucratic linkage of all institutions/organizations/corporations etc., including treating the family, legally and in public discourse, as if it was an institution. Totalitarianism has been, increasingly for about a century, the basis of Western civilization, yet totalitarianism is visibly failing, by the week. Thus, totalitarianism is no longer an option. Yet all suggested and imaginable alternatives are tried and failed, as well as being essentially unwanted by the masses, who have by now lost all positive and strong life motivations. Western man, and increasingly all human beings, just are individuals, that is the fact of it, that is how we are built to experience the world and ourselves. The collective is feeble, and getting feebler, because it cannot positively motivate us, and double negative motivations are destroying the civilization with accelerating rapidity. So, collapse of the West, and maybe world society, is baked in, accelerating, and attempts to avert it make things worse in the long term, indeed, often immediately, and there are no valid alternatives that will sustain the West, even in theory. It might seem obvious that it is time to move on to other themes. With zero possibility of large-scale communal life, then we ought to be orientating away from it, surely. Instead, the search for a political communal answer gets more desperate, even as it gets lazier, less rigorous, less truthful, more superficial. Hand-waving doesn't begin to describe the pathetic, dead-in-the-water plans and schemes that are floated, propagated, defended, with an aggressive emotionality that, quite obviously, merely disguises a deep weakness of conviction. Yet, honestly conceived, all this is extraordinarily liberating, and points towards the necessity of a life that is more wholly creative in its fundamental nature, than anything that was possible, or desirable, at any earlier point in human history. But, it seems to me, that this is only possible in the context of a Christian faith that has itself discarded the assumptions of earlier, top-down, and bureaucratic religion. In other words, we first need to recognize in our hearts that Christianity is /salvation is /theosis is, and always was meant to be, ultimately, a personal and individual and creative matter. We are not only much freer than we realize, we are much freer than most people want or are prepared to acknowledge. Nonetheless, incrementally, the reality of that freedom is being forced upon us by circumstance. That is partly because people have become distractible and dishonest about regarding freedom as a political, hence external, concept. As something that can be taken from us. But the freedom that matters eternally, is the kind that cannot be taken away, or, to put it positively, we are free whether we like it or not. The profound freedom of the creative life, or genius quest emerges naturally, and irresistibly from that recognition. Empathy versus love, and the universal empath. Bruce Charlton. In one of his best novels, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep?, Philip K. Dick explores the interesting but mistaken idea that what makes people human is empathy, which is a modern development of the term sympathy, and means something like resonance. In other words, in empathy we feel the same as another person, or another non-person being, such as an animal. We feel as they feel, much as a violin string tuned to the note of A will sympathetically resonate when impinged upon by sound on the note A from another instrument. The violin string will passively ring out the note of A. Empathy in humans has much to do with emotions, and in an empathic person, empathy is supposed to happen spontaneously, involuntarily, naturally. If we are empathic, we are supposed to feel the same emotions as another person. This is the basis of the Voigt-Kampff test in Do Androids Dream. It is intended to evoke and measure physiological correlates of empathic responses, by describing situations in which empathy is appropriate. Androids are incapable of the full range of these responses, and can only simulate them by specific programming. However, there is also a cultural belief that empathy can be trained into a habit, that, by the right attitude and will, somebody may make themselves very generally empathic. Indeed, in the modern West, empathy is so highly valued that the ideal of a good person, i.e. a promiscuous altruist, is supposed to feel the sufferings of everybody in the world, all of the time, and all animals, plants and the planet Earth, especially the suffering caused by a too high proportion of carbon dioxide percentage in the Earth's atmosphere. This universal empath could be taken as implicitly a moral exemplar of this time and place, and this notion has long since been absorbed into mainstream church Christianity. To convince others that one is a universal empath, has thus become a strategy of those who seek to dominate and manipulate. It is, in a way, the justification for the global leadership class of multi-billionaires and their servants. In sum, modern totalitarianism is rationalized by implicitly claimed attribute of universal empathy among its bureaucracy and those who control it. This is even the case among those spitefully destructive influencers who are increasingly dominating the global ruling classes. Although the mask of universal empath is slipping with increased frequency to reveal the snake-eyed demon within, the claimed basis of whatever is the current top-down manufactured war/economic crisis/health crisis/humanitarian crisis/environmental crisis, is always some version of utilitarian altruism underpinned by a passionately expressed empathy for some suffering entity, or another. So, if not, then what? If empathy as a primary positive moral value actually leads to more and more powerful evil, how ought empathy instead be conceptualized? The answer is as a minor but necessary basis for virtue. The lack of empathy is characteristic of psychopathy, which is why psychopaths go to such great lengths to simulate empathy. The true and whole virtue, of which empathy is a part, is love, and specifically Christian love, which is rooted in love of God as a person, not as an abstraction or a collection of entities, that we can perhaps understand in terms of love of divine creation and its nature and aims. In other words, to love one must first love God, divine creation, and its basis and goals. We must be on that side in the spiritual war of this world. Those who have joined the side that opposes God and creation, are in principle against Christian love, and this will undercut the strength and robustness of their love of actual persons, as well as enfeebling the reality of their love of the world. They will, under worldly pressures, tend towards becoming actors of love, and of empathy, using it as a psychopathic mask. And love is particular, love is not universal, but between specific persons, as is well shown by the fourth gospel, where that which Jesus loves is always particular, and mostly of individual persons. So we all ought to be empathic, even while the universal empath is a moral monster. We should value appropriate and genuine empathy, even as we eschew its universality. A genuine inability to be empathic is incompatible with love and with Christianity, unless it is recognized and repented. But empathy is a partial manifestation of love, and genuine empathy is only a virtue, when in a specific and Christianly loving context. And to be real and good, empathy must be personal, like love itself. Simulating specific empathies, for general categories of persons and issues, is, indeed, exactly what the soul-sold and corrupted totalitarian rulers and their obedient bureaucrats are doing when they express sympathy for designated victim groups. It is necessary to their purposes that only certain categories be permitted this synthetic empathy, because if their feigned sympathy was truly universal, then they would be excessively limited in their scope for evil-motivated policies and activities. The power and limitations of magical thinking, including in totalitarian bureaucracies, as well as Golden Dawn magical societies. Bruce Charlton. For the purposes of this post, I shall define magical thinking as the method of sustained concentration upon imagined content. Magical thinking is, or was, practiced by the Golden Dawn type magical societies, but also by such mega-mundane, and apparently anti-magical, organizations as those bureaucracies that dominate and typify the modern Western civilization. What happens is that there is a recurrent or continuous focus upon specific imagined content. The imagined content may be visual, conceptual, or any other, in principle. That imagined content takes on an objectivity by being reflected back by others in the group, and by being thought upon continually or recurrently. There is a further objectivity that derives from the process of mental training involved in making and sustaining these imagined content. Practice and effort can develop powers both of concentration, of single-point attention, of cutting out other potential contact, and also the ability inwardly to perceive the imagined content. Thus, a magician who is capable of this magical thinking, has powers with respect to other people, especially the psychological social power to stay focused on a single objective in a world where most people are highly distractible and lack any core or coherence to their belief systems. From the perspective of the magician, at least for a while, there is an apparent objective and predictive validity to their imaginings. The magician feels himself powerful, because he can, by the power of his concentration and vision, influence other people into adopting, or going along with, his plans. Because of this psychosocial influence, the magician can also perceive reality in such a way that his plans seem to be coming to fruition, or at least moving in that direction. In the vicinity of the magician, people are talking about his vision, perhaps writing and in general communicating about it. More people are being drawn into these communications, and the communications are, in some way or another, having an effect on human behavior more widely. It seems, and this impression may last considerable periods, if not stressed by other imposed pressures, that the imagined reality is coming true, being brought to reality by the power of concentrated and sustained group imagination. Those who have, like me, participated in large and professionalized bureaucracies, in my case, as a public health doctor in the National Health Service, and a participant in university management committees at several levels, do not, perhaps, realize the extent to which magical thinking is the basis of bureaucracy, and the way in which it is, or appears to be, validated by the experience of the bureaucrats and their leaders. For those on the inside, magical thinking, although that is not how it is conceptualized, really works. The committees are inspired by some imaginary vision, and they keep focused on it, talking about it, debating its implementation, writing about it, researching it, making policies, monitoring outcomes and adjusting policies, until they are absolutely convinced of its reality. And convinced, too, that their imagined vision is destined to come to pass. This kind of magical thinking is, more or less, how wholly manufactured, incoherent, impossible phenomena like the climate agenda, the trans agenda and anti-racism, have arisen, been sustained, grown, and come to seem both real and inevitable by the totalitarian system participants. And the magical thinking of magical societies was very much analogous. Through their systems of study, practice, ritual, through training in concentration and imagination, they developed a quasi-objectivity and sense of objective reality and progress that sustained them for some decades. But in this mortal and entropic world, magical thinking does not continue for very long unless infused by new personnel, resources, and top-down compulsion, supplemented by bribery and blackmail. These were not available to the magical societies, so they would decline and disappear, or fission and fight each other, or become assimilated to some other agenda that were more powerfully imposed, such as war. At an individual level, I can attest to the way that a long-term daydream-type fantasy, when combined with intense visualization and concentration, can take on a sense of destiny, such that we automatically come to expect that what we imagine and desire, at least to some sufficiently focused and long-term degree, will sooner or later come to pass. This has often been the case in my life, and so far only a very small minority of such apparent destinies have ever actually come to pass, and often those that were among the least vividly and concentratedly imagined. My purpose in this post is to suggest that magical thinking is a real thing, and has, from within, and to some extent in actuality, an objective reality, yet that it also contains many pitfalls and problems. It is not a good thing, of itself, to be able to imagine and concentrate upon chosen material, not in the way that the magical societies used to suppose, and the evidence for this is the way that analogous magical methods are employed by totalitarian bureaucracy. But neither is it necessarily a bad thing. Magical thinking can probably best be conceptualized as a trade-off, in which intensity and focus and progress on a narrow front, are achieved at the cost of a less general, less complete, understanding and participation in the totality of reality. The development of narrow sustained focus tends to diminish the capacity and possibility of self-correction, and reduces the chance of repentance when there are falsehoods, errors, and evils. It is, as always, a case of first things first, and our fundamental reality and priority ought to be Christian, and techniques ought to operate only within that primary frame. The ultimate feebleness of magical thinking is evidenced by the way it is discarded when things get serious, when the chips are down, when the groups are destroyed, corrupted and co-opted to the larger socio-political agenda of the moment. That is when we need Christianity, and we need a Christianity that is strong, sustained, autonomous, and does not depend upon group validation. We must be ready and able to stand alone with God, in spiritual terms, and to create and sustain that reality is our true priority. I don't get that other people can apparently be very happy, without, almost simultaneously, recognizing the tragedy of this mortal life. Bruce Charlton. For me, it always has been that when I am most happy, I am also saddest, most aware of the tragedy of this mortal life. For the, to me, obvious inevitability of change, and eventual death, so that the happier, more perfect, more fulfilling, deeper and more wonderful is a moment, a situation, the sadder awareness of its inevitable demise. Indeed, it is gone even as we think of it. And there is no answer to this, in this world, except for the destructive non-answer of don't think about it. Which is the modern answer, compounded of massive and continuous distraction plus intermittent intoxication and or mental blunting. This non-answer has the consequence of destroying happiness and appreciation, in order to eliminate the sadness at its inevitable demise. But, unless we can each of us grasp that this mortal life is most tragic when it is best, then perhaps we cannot grasp the magnitude of Christ's gift of resurrected eternal life. Note, I was very aware of the tragedy and happiness of this mortal life long before I was a Christian, indeed from my middle teens. The difference was that I could never discover any solution to the dilemma, and I misunderstood, and disbelieved, the Christian answer, which I falsely assumed to be the assertion that the tragedy of this life was somehow compensated by happiness in the life to come. Therefore, the only viable possibility seemed to be to try and ignore or blot out awareness of the phenomenon, as nearly everybody does, apparently, nowadays, in the West at any rate. Currently, I realize that extremely few Christians apprehend the problem, nor do they understand Jesus' solution to the tragedy of this mortal life. As usual, it's all too simple, clear and obvious, too childlike, to be graspable by the abstraction-addicted and this world-bounded Western mind. Just my own idea. What do you really want? Be a Christian, or join a club? Bruce Charlton. It is hard to communicate a simple and clear concept of what I believe it is to be a Christian. Hard to induce people to grasp that such reality is about a person choosing to follow Jesus Christ, to eternal resurrected life in heaven. Rather than real Christianity being a matter of paid-up membership, in good standing, of whatever Christian-themed club church you have decided upon, or were socialized into. I was recently asked, in perfect sincerity,
is there a name, book, school, or prophet of what you are trying to express?
And when the penny began to drop.
I see. Then it would be just your own idea.
Just my own idea. That just says it all, in a nutshell. What it means to be a Christian is indeed just my own idea. Or, to put matters differently, I take personal responsibility for my fundamental beliefs and conduct. If you want, instead, to join and obey the rules of a big club church religion based on a name, book, school, prophet, tradition, complex theology, international bureaucracy or whatever. If, that is, you choose to hand over responsibility for ultimate beliefs and conduct to some institution/organization or another, there is every inducement to do so. Or you could instead just be a Christian, to the best of your discernment. Magic, and the missing causes of the way the world works. Bruce Charlton. Something that I become more aware of with the passing years, is that there are very significant causal factors which are left out of the usual explanations for things such as the economy, civil society, even the survival of nations. Such that I am aware that we, including myself, do not really understand things half so well as we suppose. There must be a lot more going on than is realized. I really have no idea how the economy continues to provide so much stuff for so many people. I can see pretty exactly where my own income has come from and goes, but I cannot remotely do the same for others. The numbers don't add up. I can only assume that there are hidden subsidies all over the place, but how this is kept going I don't see. The high level of escalating subsidy, which goes to the lowest classes, as well as to the richest, can't all be derived from resource extractions from people like myself. There aren't enough of us. And we don't generate many real and useful resources anyway. So, while I am sure that the British economy will collapse at some point, it has continued far longer than seemed possible during the Birdemic stoppages. Hardly anybody seems to be doing anything true, or beautiful, or even useful. Most people are actively engaged in destruction, and yet. While the EU is destined to collapse, this has been the case for at least 15 years, and it is still there, and still causing mischief and mayhem on a massive scale, and still unconditionally supported by the UK ruling class. The situations, as I currently see it, is that human beings are very actively engaged in their strategic own annihilation by almost every means conceivable, including the most fundamental one of almost ceasing to reproduce, but also, recently, by trying to start pointless wars with stronger opponents. Eventually this must and shall have the massively destructive effect that humans desire. But meanwhile things continue, which I infer means that something, or rather some beings, somewhere must be working against this, or else the destruction would have long since happened. I do not believe that this is only a matter of buffering destructive change. That would not suffice. There must be actual opposition to the destruction, there must, in other words, be some positively creative activity. But it really does not seem that positive creative activity is coming from human beings. In other words, something magical, which means something unconsidered by our explanatory models, something out with our materialist explanations, something working by spiritual not physical means, is at work. And that magical spiritual something is not coming from the human beings, more exactly only very few human beings seem to be involved, and these not human powers for good are slipping under the radar. So things continue much longer that our knowledge and understanding suggest that they could or should. Yet, instead of noticing this, being grateful, and acknowledging and supporting these non-human beings for protecting us from our own malign motivations, the lesson most people draw is that we can and should continue our strategic destructiveness, on the basis that it is not really destructive. For so long as the society does not actually collapse into rampant/endemic violence, disease, famine, chaos, for so long the mass of people, especially, but not only, the rulers, can and will continue to claim that this means their nihilism and spitefulness are good for the economy, peace, security, decency. And even when chaos supervenes, it seems that the collapse will be blamed upon those scattered and weak human beings who still try to do good, who recognize and endorse truth, beauty and virtue. Meanwhile, it is worth remembering that we share our nations with a multitude of other, not human, beings, animals, plants, and spirits of many kinds including, but not only, the dead, angels, and the elemental beings that modern man regards as non-living. Some of these magical spirits are apparently doing their best to sustain that which human beings are doing their worst to destroy. The God-aligned and good among these non-physical, magical, spirit beings are, I presume, the missing cause that explains, could we but understand their activities, why things are not already much worse than they actually are. The Greatest Temptation. Francis Berger.
In Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor lurks a dreadful idea. Who can be sure, he says, metaphorically, of course, that when the crucified Christ uttered his cry, "Lord, why hast thou forsaken me?" he did not call to mind the temptation of Satan, who for one word had offered him dominion over the world. And, if Jesus recollected this offer, how can we be sure that he did not repent not having taken it? One had better not be told about such temptations. Lev Shestov, all things are possible.
The idea is dreadful because it diametrically opposes what Jesus created and what he offers via his creation, or, as Dr. Charlton calls it, the second creation. The Synoptic Gospels describe Jesus rejecting all of Satan's temptations, including dominion over the world. The story does not appear in the fourth Gospel, though a case for the appearance of the three temptations can be made, subject of another post, perhaps. It is clear that Jesus had no regrets about resisting the devil's three temptations, making the temptation to think otherwise a great temptation, indeed. The reasons for Jesus' rejection should require no explanation, yet I am sure that some Christians secretly wish Jesus had taken dominion of the world. If nothing else, it would justify their own seeming inability to resist such temptations or, at the very least, seriously entertain them. Just supposing you are a traditionalist Christian who wants to submit to the objective authority of the one true church. Bruce Charlton. Just supposing you are a traditionalist Christian who wants to submit to the objective authority of the church, because you believe that the church has been ordained by God and Jesus Christ as the timeless repository of objective truth. What then? First you will join that church. Immediately you are confronted by a problem: which particular branch of that church do you join? Where do you go? Who do you ask? What do you believe? There is dissent, there are conflicts, the validity of various churches within the church is contested, often vehemently. One branch says that another branch is apostate, or heretical. These judgments may indeed be reciprocal. Where do you even begin to start to join the true church, when it is not clear what the church actually is? At the very first hurdle, the traditionalist has no alternative but to use his own personal discernment. He cannot obey or submit until after he has personally decided who is worthy of his obedience and submission. And this absolute and unavoidable requirement for personal discernment never stops. Even once he has converted, and is within his chosen branch of the true church, he will find conflicting beliefs and instructions. He will not discover coherent uniformity, but instead dissent and conflict. The traditionalist may be absolutely genuine in his motivation to obey and submit to absolute eternal truth as defined by the essential church, but at every turn he will be compelled to discern who and where this truth is located, because there are always multiple and exclusive claimants of authority. The traditionalist does not want to choose. Indeed, his faith is built upon the conviction that personal discernment of truth is inadequate and spiritually perilous, yet he cannot escape the necessity. What then is his reaction to the brute fact of endemic and inescapable discernment? Sadly, too often, his reaction is to deny that it is happening. His reaction is to claim, or pretend, that, as a traditionalist, he is simply obedient, humbly submitting to the external and objective authority of the church. His essential and frequent acts of personal discernment are swept under the carpet, hand-waved into oblivion, suppressed and then forgotten. And instead the traditionalist maintains his attention externally, outside of himself, by embracing a zealous stance of near-continuous attack on anyone who dissents from what he has personally discerned to be the ideal of submissive obedience to the one true objective church's authority. Well, people can apparently convince themselves of almost anything, but they cannot prevent others from seeing just exactly what they are doing. Robert Graves as an extreme instance of projection. Bruce Charlton. I have often written of Robert Graves, because, with G.B. Shure, he was the first grown-up writer I engaged with after Lord of the Rings had opened the door to adult literature for me. Both Graves and Shure were recommended by my father, Graves because of I Claudius and my burgeoning interest in history. I have, very gradually, come to realize that Graves was almost the opposite of what he claimed to be, but that his claims were believed, by me, and many others, because he was a superb, the word is intended descriptively, non-fictional prose writer. Graves claimed to be primarily a poet, a lyrical poet, in opposition to those well-connected and socially endorsed Apollonian versifiers of intellect and scholarship that Graves contemptuously dissected and vilified in his critical writings. But in truth, Graves was not a lyrical poet, and was instead exactly the kind of poet his writings rejected. He was an upper-class, academic, uninspired clique poet, one of a closed circle of mutual admiration and log-rolling. Contrary to his own claims, he expended great energy on unpoetic/anti-poetic activities such as wire pulling, self-promotion, image management and the like. He acted a part of an impoverished wild and Celtic bard, yet was actually a wealthy and influential, and hard-working, Bohemian Norman, doing exactly the kind of stuff that Bohemian Normans had been doing for generations. Outside this group of not poets, none of Graves' verses have achieved the spontaneous endorsement and love of those who are a part of the, now extinct, apparently, tradition of English lyrics, i.e. the Palgrave's Golden Treasury tradition. Graves has several great qualities, including an unexcelled prose style. In a sense he was a great critic of historical poetry, although his judgment of modern, 20th century, poetry was so wrong as to be inverted. But Graves was fraudulent in his nature, he lived a lie. At one level, although nothing like so deep as he claimed, Graves wanted to be something he was not, a poet, but pretended to be it anyway, and worked to persuade as many others as possible. In this respect he resembles Charles Williams, although Williams was lower middle class, not a Norman. Williams wanted to be a poet but wasn't, and expended great energies on literary, critical and educational activity to persuade others to endorse himself as a poet. And yet also, he did not want to be a poet as much as he pretended to himself, because he dissipated most of his time and energy on hack works, apparently undertaken so that he could have extra income for a more self-indulgent lifestyle. In sum, Graves was himself exactly the kind of pseudo-poet, fake poet, whose verse is not divinely inspired but instead the consequence of scholarship and intelligence, skeletal structures decorated with borrowed or stolen plumage taken from real poets. Graves's critical strictures were therefore projection, he publicly excoriated in others his own unacknowledged faults, deficiencies. And by this means Graves concealed from himself, and others, his own innate nature, origins, workings, status, and stature. Graves's great advantage over his fellow not real poets came from his prose non-fiction, works such as The White Goddess, his brilliant and calculatedly dishonest autobiography Goodbye to All That, or his critical lectures and essays, such as The Common Asphodel. Critical and historical prose by which Graves created a mythology of which he was arbiter, and by which he was defined as a true muse poet. It is, apparently, all there, all explained, all in place. Except for some actual real poems. The lesson I draw from this is general. It is, I think, easy to be misled by propaganda, including self-propaganda, and especially when it emanates from a ruling class who control so much of the social institutions, and whose members often operate in mutually reinforcing cliques and factions. This misleading can go even so far as inversion, such that what is supposed is the opposite of what is actual. A supposedly beautiful person, building, or piece of music may actually be soulless ugliness. An alleged truth breakthrough of science or medicine may actually be a tissue of invention and calculated distortion. A promoted pattern of virtue in a person or institution may be actual evil of a very extreme kind. And such inversions are often achieved by implication and projection, by such double negations. Those who are most self-consciously the opposite of good, have insider knowledge of the workings of that which opposes good, and can therefore provide convincingly detailed analyses of the projected evils of their enemies. Political leaders, for instance, very often do in actuality precisely those things that they vocally and theoretically eschew, and absolutely do not do anything effective to deter or suppress those phenomena they rhetorically oppose. This is why it is so often observed that those active in charities against specific abuses often themselves engage in exactly these abuses, and indeed use the organization and resources of their charities the better to prosecute these vices. In such a world as we now inhabit, this phenomenon of projection is very general in the high-status officialdom and media, to the point almost of universality. Consequently, it is vital to look behind the rhetoric, to observe what is actually done, and not done, and consciously to deploy our innate capacity of intuitive inference. Do you follow man or God? William Wildblood. I believe absolutely in the truth of Christ, and yet I do not belong to an established church or spiritual organization of any kind. I might even go so far as to say it's because I believe in Christ that I do not belong to any church. The reason is that we are living in that time known as the latter days in Christian eschatology, and this is a time of spiritual decline during which all outer forms of spirituality, including those religions which have previously promoted and protected truth, are falling away from the purity of their original vision. But that is not the only problem, for while these avenues to truth were more than sufficient to satisfy man's spiritual needs in the past, They all arose at a time when human consciousness was rather different to what it is now, so they can no longer perform their function effectively. The fact is, outward forms of religion are right and necessary for souls at a certain stage, but there comes a time when the individual needs to transfer his attention away from the outer path to the inner, and that often means going beyond conventional religion. In the past that was not so necessary, but in these end times it is increasingly the case. If a religion is made up of body and soul, which are the outer structure and the inner animating vision, it is surely obvious that in a time of materialism the body will loom large while the soul will recede. The religion turns into an institution, which means it is no longer a real religion. And from that arises my chief complaint against the modern churches, which is that they have all allowed themselves to be corrupted by this world. All too often they now conceive of spirituality horizontally, which means their eyes are fixed on human beings rather than God. Doubtless this is part of a demonic attempt to undermine truth, but it is aided and abetted by the feeble quality of church leaders who, for the most part, are not men of vision, still less saints or mystics, but administrators and bureaucrats, more concerned with their organization than divine truth. The result has been they have conceded more and more ground to the modernist ideology of worldly progress, and now have values little different from the current left/liberal ethos, which is founded on the centrality of the human being as he appears to be in this world. This is a process that has been ongoing for well over a century, but has really picked up speed over the last few decades. The result is that much official Christianity is now a hollowed-out shell. It has followed the world instead of renouncing it. It has succumbed to the temptation of appearing loving rather than actually being loving, and it has done this because it has misconceived love, restricting it to a kind of non-judgmental egalitarianism due to the earthly self rather than the developing soul. Tolerance, currently meaning full acceptance of pretty much anything regardless of what it is, has become more important to it than truth. That has inevitably led to a loss of truth and a disconnect from the transcendent God, with the result that many churches now seem more concerned with matters of social justice than spiritual transformation. And all this has come about because contemporary Christianity has made the huge mistake of trying to compromise with the modern world. Many branches of Christianity have followed that path and despiritualized themselves. They have become absorbed into the modern anti-spiritual mindset because they were not strong enough to resist it. The spirituality of the leaders and members of these branches of religion has been too shallow, too insubstantial and too little felt for them to be able to shake off the influences of this world. Consequently, they have accommodated themselves to it, become part of it, and are now not only indistinguishable from it but actively fight on its side and against real religion, if by that we mean, as we should, spiritual truth. Official Christianity has compromised. The trouble with compromise is that it tends to assume truth lies between two extremes. But does truth lie between the extremes of right and wrong? Does it lie between God and no God, between truth and a lie? Evidently not, but when a lie is powerful enough, and almost universally accepted, it can take on the mantle of a truth. The only thing to do then is to reject it and point out its falseness. You cannot make a compromise with it, or you will be infected by it, and the infection will spread, eventually taking over completely. This is what has happened in the Western world, which has set the agenda for everywhere else. The only justification for a religion is that it is a doorway to the supernatural. When the doorway is open, the religion functions as it should. But when the supernatural is no longer the absolute be-all and end-all of the religion, it is spiritually defunct, even if it carries on existing, even if it grows and spreads. This is based on a chapter from Remember the Creator. How the establishment have become both rulers and victims in the New Left era, post-middle 1960s. Bruce Charlton. Not many people realize that the left underwent a major reorientation through the 1950s and 60s, which was largely completed in the USA by the late 1960s, spreading from there, via the mass media, finance and the economy, and the mass media, to include the Anglosphere, Western Europe, and the globalist/multinational institutions. This was the reorientation away from old left socialism, with its focus upon class, with the proletariat/working class, of native-born men, as its core virtue group, and towards ruling class personnel who are defined in terms of membership in a variety of virtue groups. The New Left was what has come to rule the world, and the new orientation was based on a proliferating collection of virtue groups, based upon not economic divisions but instead race, sex, and sexuality. This had the great advantage that the oppressed, victim, virtue group could now be members of part of the upper class, the ruling class. It had been a disadvantage of old left socialism that the ruling class, who managed the whole thing, were always under pressure to favor and incorporate lower class people into the elite, where the New Left routinely framed ultra-privileged, ultra-wealthy establishment figures as their new deserving class, to be accorded legal protection and promotion. So we have, by now, become used to the idea that the exemplary assumed intrinsically virtuous persons of the modern left, are drawn from ruling class backgrounds. Many have wealthy and powerful parents, and a high proportion have experienced grooming via establishment educational establishments. Others are from among the very wealthy and powerful ruling families. In sum, the New Left virtue group are mostly extremely privileged individuals, locked into establishment power structure, who are nonetheless defined as victims simply by categories relating to race, sex, or sexuality, or some other national, social or ethnic feature. The old socialist virtue group, native-born working men, have indeed been demoted so low, that the situation is inverted. The privileged classes are a non-working benefits-dependent client underclass, any immigrant from anywhere else, any race other than those native to the West, any religion other than Christianity, and any sex/sexuality other than men with families. To this has been added environmentalism, which favors some conceptualization of planetary benefit, currently almost exclusively the atmospheric concentration of CO2, to replace human beings as the proper focus of concern. It is important to recognize that what is defined as good for the environment is now conceptually controlled entirely by the ruling class, via ruling class-controlled social institutions. Of course, New Leftism is oppositional, hence incoherent by its very nature, so that there is still lip service paid to old leftism, but that is all it is. There are words, but never actions, to help the proletariat. In actuality, the New Left is an expandable collection of double negative imperatives, which are focused upon in rotation, and according to expediencies. Where is this going? There is no imaginable utopia, and public attention is instead focused upon the avoidance of an expanding range of projected dystopias. The difference between old and new left is therefore profound. The old left was based on coherent but untrue positive assertions about class and economics, and aimed for a describable, albeit in practice impossible, socialist utopia. The new left now functions almost entirely using ruling class personnel, who are also designated victims. And it had made itself the only recognized spokesman and representative for those other virtuous entities that are not included in the ruling class, such as those human individuals and groups that are incapable of leadership, as well as animals, plants, and the planet. The great triumph of new leftism has been to create a socially dominant morality by which the ruling class are encapsulated as both uniquely virtuous and uniquely powerful. This explains a lot. This always makes me think of a comment made by an old friend, the author Frank Kupner, who was reading some feminist journalist in The Guardian, someone like Polly Toynbee, one who had been born to rich and famous parents, with all the advantages of nepotism, top status boarding school, Oxbridge etc., raging about the oppression of women. Frank quietly summarized her rant as, suffering. I'll show you suffering. Romantic eschatology. Francis Berger. An illuminating description of a journey that very much mirrors Barfield's ideas on participation. In his famous book on the Romantics, Natural Supernaturalism, Abrams argues that many of the Romantic works follow the theme, exemplified in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, of the circuitous journey. This journey basically consists in three parts. 1. Unconscious unity. The unconscious unity is the potentially fecund but actually meaningless abyss. This is the absolute, but it is a unity that is nothing in the sense of no thing. It is a chaos of pure potency, a meaningless chaos of indeterminism. 2. Alienation from others and nature. Alienation is emergence of the individual, conscious self. But this emergence requires the split between the natural or unconscious realm of objects, and the conscious realm of the individual subject. This is a false split that can only be healed by the imagination. Alienation can be thought of as a series of false images or projections of the self and its relation to the world. For F. W. J. von Schelling and Budai F., this involves two forms of evil/despair that arise from within this condition: 1. To be swallowed up in chaos, 2. To create such a stultifying order as to do away with freedom. Each has a myriad of representations, and each is a false image of the self. 3. Conscious unity, or, the mediation of the imagination between nature and the human. This is represented in the return home, but it is not a return to the innocence of phase 1 consciousness but is at a higher and more intense level. In romantic and dialogical visions, this termination of the quest was usually thought of as social, represented in the ideal of love. Both the self and other are preserved in a higher unity. Schelling's Of Human Freedom states, "This is the secret of love, that it unites such being as could each exist in itself, and nonetheless neither is nor can be without the other." And this is the secret of eternal love, that which would fain be absolute in itself nonetheless does not regard it as a deprivation to be so in itself but is so only in and with another. Good intentions, yes, but. Bruce Charlton. In a world where there are too many interacting and unknown causes for effects to be predictable from actions, then good intentions are crucial. So long, that is, as the intentions are real, not merely excuses for self-interest or spiteful destruction, and are really good, and not double negations, for instance. Because genuinely good intentions is a way of describing being consciously on the side of God and divine creation. And because it is only GIs that will take into account how things are working out in practice, which may be very different from what was hoped, and can make adjustments, and will, because genuinely good in intent, continue monitoring the developing situation. That this is so rare, is indicative of the rarity of genuinely good intentions. So, real good intentions are vital, they are, in this meaning, the only way of doing good in this world. Yet if intentions are good only when God-aligned, then genuine GIs are pretty much restricted to situations when love is the motivator, actual, real love, between particular persons, or beings, and therefore not some generalized abstraction of love. General but vague benign attitudes towards individuals or groups, or the favoring of abstract causes, do not suffice. Which analysis wipes out almost all, but not all, of what passes for good intentions in public discourse. What is the relevance? Well, it is intended to explain the wrong-headedness of a good deal of the kind of thing that groups of spiritual people, whether in a church, or some other society, whether Christian or not, get up to. For mainstream Christians, this refers to group prayer, when it is directed to specific personas and worldly outcomes, but when those persons and outcomes are not loved, for instance when they are remote and abstract. Group prayers can and may avoid such things, but there is a prevalent idea that a group of people can, by pooling their good intentions in prayer, or indeed some other form of ritual activity, achieve positive results in the world at large, for instance in praying for peace, or relief of some current sufferings. This is part of a generally therapeutic and this worldly tendency of current religion and spirituality, the basis of which is that suffering is the worst thing, and the best thing is to relieve or, better, prevent suffering. At the end of which goal lies a nightmare dystopia of consciousness obliteration, including suicide and murder, done with a compassionate rationale. Western civilization is approaching this situation with considerable rapidity. I think it is worth remembering that thoughts are actions, and thoughts therefore have consequences, so such ideas as group interventions by prayer are not absurd. However, it is not true that groups are more powerful than individuals, nor is it true that the intentions of groups are usually genuinely good. The point to remember is responsibility. Who is spiritually responsible for the outcome? The big problem is that groups almost never accept, or even consider, this matter, and, in this modern era, there is apparently no genuine way by which most groups can learn from what happens as a consequence of group intentions and actions. As usual, the conclusion seems to be that the individual is primary when it comes to genuinely good intentions, and, here and now, truly loving groups are rare outside of the family situation. As of 2024 in the West, it is nigh impossible for an institution, including a church, to be good. And that part of goodness is a continued and responsible engagement with the love, so that what we suppose to be good does not, instead, turn out to emanate in evil. We need to love, and continue to love, if we want to do good. Good intentions cannot be plucked from the branches of external public discourse, but need, instead, to be derived from our own capacity and direction of love. Only that kind of good intention will align us with divine creation, and have the best chance of doing actual good. What is the meaning of romantic in romantic Christianity, and how does it differ from pleasure-seeking or psychotherapy? Bruce Charlton. We need clearly to distinguish between, on the one hand, the psychotherapeutic aspects of spirituality and religion, and, on the other hand, participation. Romantic Christianity is primarily, and essentially about participation, not pleasure or therapy. Although romanticism without Christianity usually devolves into pleasure-seeking and or therapy. Therapy focuses on emotions and feelings, while participation is a fact about reality. Participation is the fact that we are involved with reality, including that our inner life is involved with reality. In other words, we are not separate from reality, we are not cut off from reality, even in our innermost thinking and feeling, even though most modern people feel that they are cut off, even though we wrongly believe that we are observers rather than participants in the universe. So, participation means that we just are, like it or not, know it or not, want it or not, participants in divine creation. The felt need of romanticism is to be aware that we are participants in reality. Thus, romanticism is a good impulse for Christians, it is spiritually positive, because it is the aspiration to become more spiritually developed, more godlike in our consciousness of reality. Psychotherapy is not only distinguishable from romanticism, but also the two can be separated and dissociated, so that we can have one without the other, we can have therapy without participation, and participation without therapy. Obviously, there can be therapy without participation, and this is the normal, mainstream and dominant form of therapy in modern Western civilization. It is also what historically happened to Romanticism when it rejected Christianity. We got the pleasure-seeking of Byron instead of the participation-seeking of Coleridge, and a century later, we got the therapeutic intent of Jung instead of the participation-seeking of Steiner and Barfield. For instance, people can be made to feel happier or less miserable by distraction from reality, as by the mass and social media, or by suppression of awareness, by inner materialism and bureaucracy. Distraction from and suppression of awareness of the fact of participation both diminish participation, and are anti-romantic. And there can be participation without therapy. This happens when recognition of our involvement with reality makes us feel more miserable here and now. This might be through a recognition of evil in our situation, or by recognizing the tragic quality of a life that ends with death, tragic even when death has lost its sting from resurrection, and of a mortal earthly world of endemic degeneration, disease, and loss. In sum, romanticism is not some form of pleasure-seeking, but is instead a recognition of the benefits, indeed I would say necessity, of consciously recognizing the fact of our continuing participation in God's created reality. Asking/giving advice, the example of Newcastle upon Tyne. Bruce Charlton. Some of the people who ask for advice do not intend to take it, they may even be intending to react against it. Or they may be seeking to avoid responsibility by saying, to themselves, if not to others, that they are only doing what they have been told, although this doesn't make sense, since the advice was sought, and the decision to follow it was made. Some people, especially immature ones, are keen to give advice, and some of these actually expect others to follow it. So there is potential for some pretty pathological interactions here. It can be flattering to the inexperienced to be approached for advice, and this approach for advice may therefore be a method of manipulation. The whole business of advice assumes a generalizability from the individual to the group, the assumption that what is the case for me here now, is, or ought to be, the case for somebody/everybody else, in other circumstances. It was only in my middle 20s that I, finally, began to realize that I was apparently highly atypical, such that most other people saw the world very differently, and wanted very different things. Until then I had assumed that such differences were due to other people not knowing about stuff, and if they knew what I did then they would think like I did. But eventually the reality dawned that this was not the case. I was, indeed, an extremely unusual person, and therefore what worked for me would not necessarily work for others, because others wanted something very different, and were gratified by, and found aversive, very different places and people and situations. I can only talk about the past, because things will surely change in the future, but I have realized that the place for me has been Newcastle upon Tyne. I assume that this is somewhat due to family history, personal history and stuff like that, and therefore I have not assumed that what suited me and what I was up to, would suit other people. I would not be likely to advise people to live here, just because it suits me. And not just me, also my family, which is of course, decisive. After all, I dislike a great deal about this place and its people, and indeed I don't like very much of Newcastle. Probably most of the city and people I find aversive, and avoid. Other aspects I love in a way that goes very deep and has provided an unique sustenance. Nonetheless, I'm always a bit surprised when other people want to live here, and by the gravitational pull that some other people feel towards it. I think one great advantage of Newcastle is that it has been more real and coherent than most places. I felt this in contrast to the city of my school days, Bristol. That reality may be unpleasant or simply alien to some people, and it is always dissolving in response to the depredations of totalitarian materialism. And there may come a time when I feel a need to move elsewhere. But, for me, it is important that the place I live has an objective kind of solidity, to which I personally am connected. No matter how pleasant some other places may be for most people with their different natures and goals, if that place feels not real to me, or I am not inwardly connected, then life feels arbitrary, and that is, for me, so bad, that it seems to spoil everything else. Or, to put matters positively, I have been very fortunate to find and, mostly, live somewhere about which I feel romantic and in which participation has been attainable for much of the time. But still, I would not be likely to advise anybody else to live here. I spent my school years in Somerset near Bristol, and am still very fond of visiting that area, although I have gone off Bristol itself since the millennium, but I did not find it difficult to leave the area. This may be attributable to having been born in Devon, and experiencing an alienating dislocation when we moved, from several understandable causes in combination, plus the facts of loss and strangeness. For several years afterwards, Devon felt magical, safe and natural, while Somerset was comparatively seedy, dull, because of long days at school, mostly, and somewhat threatening. But I have very seldom been to Devon in the past 50 years, and not at all for more than 30. A stab at romantic Christian eschatology. Francis Berger. In my last post, I shared an excerpt from an article that outlined romantic eschatology. The participation in the framework described was rooted entirely in romanticism, with only partial allusions to Christianity. However, the partial allusions revealed much. Romanticism proper, assuming such a thing existed, largely embraced the evolution of consciousness but eventually distanced itself from Christianity. Christianity proper denies the evolution of consciousness and regards romanticism as an error and a threat. In the end, neither offers a viable solution to the problem of alienation. Alienation is the emergence of the individual, conscious self. But this emergence requires the split between the natural or unconscious realm of objects, and the conscious realm of the individual subject. This is a false split that can only be healed by the imagination. Alienation can be thought of as a series of false images or projections of the self and its relation to the world. For F. W. J. von Schelling and Badiaf, this involves two forms of evil/despair that arise from within this condition: 1. To be swallowed up in chaos, 2. To create such a stultifying order as to do away with freedom. Each has a myriad of representations, and each is a false image of the self. Neither Romanticism nor Christianity have been able to heal the false split via imagination. Granted, Romanticism was fueled by the imagination, but with little or no grounding in Christianity, eventually became swallowed up in chaos. Conversely, by rejecting the evolution of consciousness, Christianity doubled down on its stultifying order and stifled freedom and, consequently, imagination. The solution, as far as I can see, lies in the amalgamation of Romanticism and Christianity. I do not think this can happen at the institutional church level, at least not yet. For the time being, it will be limited to individuals. Moreover, the nature and quality of any such amalgamation will be set by the individual, and his honest and sincere relationship and communication with the Holy Ghost. The goal, if it can be described as such, is overcoming alienation. More precisely, recognizing and, to the best of one's ability, overcoming the false images or projections of the self, and its relation to the world. These relations include, nay, are founded upon, the individual's relationship with the divine. This relationship must be rooted in freedom, freedom that strives for the actualization of concrete love. In his essay of Human Freedom, F. W. J. von Schelling offers some insight into what such a striving aims for. This is the secret of love, that it unites such being as could each exist in itself, and nonetheless neither is nor can be without the other. And this is the secret of eternal love, that which would fain be absolute in itself nonetheless does not regard it as a deprivation to be so in itself but is so only in and with another. The internet is no longer meaningfully searchable, true, but does it really matter, when we can't do anything about it? Bruce Charlton. William James Tykonevich. Quote, The exact figures will vary depending on what you search for, but on average Google delivers 0.0001% search results and 99.99% censorship. You think those numbers are exaggerated, but they're not. The internet is no longer meaningfully searchable. It's time to start relying more on serendipity and word of mouth. End quote. I began to realize the extent of global totalitarianism when I realized that, despite that Google's 30-year-old search engine had objectively gotten much worse in functionality over the past 20 years, Google is still the best search engine, overall, by some margin. Our choice as of 2025 is between a crap, and getting ever crappier, search engine, or something even worse. Somehow, apparently, from what the masses are allowed to access, nobody in the world has been able to do better than a 3-decades-old search algorithm, despite that the functionality of that algorithm has been deliberately all but destroyed. This is impossible, if the world of technological development and market competition is truly anything like it is supposed to be, as it is portrayed in public discourse. Therefore, the catastrophic decline of Google search and the failure to develop/make available anything better, is conclusive evidence of the top-down political power of the system to control global usage of one of the most important single pieces of modern technology. And if the establishment controls this, then it must also control many other things. Yet. The vast majority are oblivious/indifferent to all this. Fatalism, we can't do anything about it, leads on to nihilism, it doesn't really matter anyway, then to a kind of denialism that refuses even to think about such things. The reason is obvious, and the reason is atheistic materialism, which has it that whatever we, you and I, understand and know is of zero significance to the world, because understanding and knowing are, of themselves, merely subjective things, going on privately inside our skulls. Confined to brains, where the thoughts do nothing, and make no difference to the world. And the mainstream majority conclusion, is that understanding and knowing does no good. In fact, they do harm, by making us miserable. And in a finite material mortal life, there is literally nothing worse than my misery, now. The conclusion is therefore, best to go with the flow, don't even try to understand, and make the best of whatever is the current situation. But if we inhabit a Christian divine creation, and if our personal understanding really makes a difference to objective spiritual reality, well, then it is well worth noticing, thinking, and trying to understand stuff. So does it matter that the internet is no longer meaningfully searchable? Yes, it matters. Even though you and I can do nothing about it in a material/political sense. Because there is a life lesson concerning the nature of this, our reality, there is something that we ought to learn, and which it is good to understand. What is our civilization's transitional situation, by analogy with Middle-earth? Commentary on an essay by Tree of Woe. Bruce Charlton. Over at the Notion Club Papers blog, I have discussed an interesting essay from the Tree of Woe website, in which the author draws analogies, and inspiration, from the example of Elendil in rebuilding Arnor and Gondor from the remains of Númenor. The Tree of Woe author, who has commented here, and who I respect as a thoughtful, but in my opinion very over-optimistic, reactionary thinker, influenced by Spengler, and with a strong interest in Tolkien, has written a big essay suggesting that Western civilization is now at an crux analogous to the transformations between Tolkien's second, Númenorian, age, and the third age of the dwindling of Númenor, and elves and dwarves. Regarding the previous era of modernity, and the Industrial Revolution as a Faustian age, Tree of Woe presents a detailed argument that Elendil is the current equivalent cultural figure that Faust was for the era from which we are emerging. So that J.R.R. Tolkien's fictional character of Elendil is, or could represent, a current analogy to what the historical figure of Goethe, and his fictional/legendary character of Faust represented for the late 1700s and early 1800, and until recently. Tree of Woe's conclusion is as follows.
Yet this ought be no cause for despair. If the Aenean spirit, i.e. the spirit of Aeneas who in legend fled the defeated Troy to set and train the foundation of Rome, and indeed Britain, or Tolkien's northern courage means anything, it means that the fight must be fought regardless of the likelihood of success. And Tolkien's myths remind us that even in decline, there is beauty, heroism, and meaning. The Elendilian age, if it were to come, might not shine as brightly as the Faustian, or even the Aenean, but it would still carry forward the light of what came before. And in the end, that light, however faint, will be enough to illuminate the path for those who follow.
I think Tree of Woe is mistaken, and that our culture is not at an analogous transition of second to third age, but instead at a much later phase during or following Tolkien's fourth age, as, indeed, Tolkien himself said many times. There are indeed genuine similarities with Tolkien's second to third age, but essentially we are at a far later stage of cultural decline, in which the mainstream, dominant highest status official worldview, widely shared by the masses, especially in the West, is atheist materialism. For the first time in history, we inhabit a world in which deity is regarded as unreal, ignored or ridiculed, and indeed opposed and inverted, in which the material is regarded as the only reality, and in which a kind of incoherent but moralistic hedonism is the global ideology. In other words, here and now it is regarded as obvious and ethically imperative that the alleviation of suffering and promotion of gratification ought to be the underlying basis of all ideologies and policies. Yet the ruling ideology of leftism is not coherent, precisely because it is essentially oppositional, and opposition to God, creation and the good can and does take limitless and mutually inconsistent forms, and that there is a strand of leftism expressing indifference to human experience, and instead taking the side of the planet Earth, or the biosphere, against men. The consequence is that we are in an era of established and increasing value inversion, which means that what have been regarded throughout human history as the values of goodness, roughly, truth, beauty, virtue, coherence, have been inverted so that good is now regarded as evil, and sin as virtue. We are therefore in a fundamentally unprecedented situation, and in a far more deeply corrupted and evil situation than was the case in Tolkien's second, or third, age. And a situation in which the ideal of preservation of this uniquely depraved culture has itself become aversive to the best of people, and the best within each person. Demotivation has become so prevalent and pervasive that even basic human survival, and reproductive, instincts have become diminished, to the point of ineffectuality. That is, when they are not actually inverted into covert or explicit cultural and personal self-hatred, and an active desire for, suicidal, personal and cultural annihilation. My impression is that Tree of Woe recognizes this, and seeks for an antidote to the consequent demotivation and despair. D are indeed sins to a Christian, despair representing lack of faith in God's creative power and loving nature, and demotivation representing a giving up on our destiny in this mortal life. But Tree of Woe is seeking to reconstruct a motivating and optimistic ideology from selected and secular aspects of the past, so that instead of passive, or active, acquiescence in terminal decline, a fight will be fought. The intent is that decline would be opposed, and a work of preservation and rebuilding begun, on the basis of the new Western spirit, analogous to the Elendil's creation of Arnor and Gondor in remembrance, as lesser derivatives, of Númenor. I regard this optimism as mistaken for at least two reasons. One reason why Tree of Woe is mistaken, is that human beings have changed, irrevocably. I call this the development of consciousness, such that they neither want, nor could sustain, past forms of human societies. The future must therefore be something that accepts the givenness of current basic human nature, and adds to it to restore God, creation, and the world of spirit. The outcome will be something fundamentally unprecedented, not a restoration. But what that outcome shall be we cannot know until after enough individuals have personally changed. I believe that this developmental process must be conscious and voluntary, and come from the inner freedom of each individual. A worse society can indeed be imposed top-down, by the ruling class, by propaganda, brainwashing and external incentives, bribes and blackmail. This is indeed what we have seen, accelerating, over the past 50 years. But a better society can only arise bottom-up, from robust positive change in sufficient individual persons. That is, bottom-up in socio-political terms, but it is vital to remember that anything good will be aided by God, via His continuing divine creation. Any good an individual does, including in thought, in the spiritual realm, shall be incorporated into ongoing divine creation. The second reason why his proposals do not fly, is that Tree of Woe is applying a fundamentally secular analysis to history, whereas all historical societies were, IMO, primarily religious, i.e. they perceived and interpreted the world through the lens of their religions. Therefore Tree of Woe's selective version of history leaves out that which was most important to historical societies, that upon which both their coherence was based, and in which their core motivation was rooted. This omission of that which was fundamental to past societies is a further reason why this kind of restoration cannot work. Finally, to add a specifically Christian perspective, Tree of Woe is basically mistaken to seek a solution to demotivation and despair in this mortal life and world. The human condition is, as the ancients all knew, essentially tragic, and anything we can do, even in theory, is merely palliative. What this means is that, while motivation and hope are necessary to mortal life, no fundamentally secular material socio-political plan or destiny can provide sufficient motivation and hope. The answer is to start with and build upon a solid basis for hope that comes from the expectation of resurrected eternal life, and personal knowledge of the reality of the personal and loving God the Creator. Only after that perspective has been established can we attain that hope which overcomes despair. Freedom stalls when you can't let go. Francis Berger. As I currently see it, the philosophies of thinkers like Berger and Schelling, thinkers who correctly advanced the primacy of freedom in Christianity and thus liberated it somewhat from confining and constraining doctrines and dogmas, all culminate in what I can only describe as truncation, not in the abridgment sense, but rather in the sense of being cut short, especially at the end. Berger and Schelling go far and deep in their explorations of freedom. However, in the end, I am inevitably left with the frustrating feeling that none of them went far or deep enough. Within this perspective, their respective philosophies strike me as probes that successfully inquired and explored beyond some of the limits set by antecedent assumptions yet were ultimately incapable of extending beyond other seemingly enforced boundaries. Chief among these is the adherence to the strict monotheistic conceptualization of God, which then necessitated the inclusion of some, if not all, of the omni-attributes of the mono-God who creates from nothing, albeit tweaked with philosophical qualifications throughout. Regardless of how far and deep any of these philosophers of freedom went, their explorations were curtailed or hemmed in by some aspect of the assumptions they seemed, whether consciously or not, to be metaphysically arguing against. None could bring himself to the point of simply letting go in the metaphysical sense. And if they did, they kept it to themselves.